Get your things, you're mine now, whispered the Apache to the widow he couldn't forget, and in those quiet words, uttered under the pale glow of a dying fire, the course of two broken lives began to change. She was called Eliza, a woman whose days had been stitched together with sorrow since the night her husband was taken by fever and her home reduced to silence. Once, she had lived in the comfort of laughter and companionship, with a partner who walked beside her through the fields and brought warmth to her small, fragile cabin. Now she awoke each morning to the emptiness of her bed, the stillness of the air, and the haunting ache of conversations that would never be spoken again. Her neighbors pitied her, some offered bread, others offered whispered prayers, but none could fill the hollowed place inside her heart where love had once lived. She wore her grief like a second skin, invisible yet undeniable, until one afternoon a figure returned from her past, a man she never thought she would see again, tall, with weather-beaten skin, dark hair tied back, and eyes that carried both fire and an old, tender sorrow. He was Apache, a man who belonged to the land more than to the settlements, someone who had drifted into her life years before when her wagon had broken on the road, and who had fixed it without asking for thanks. That day he had barely spoken, only nodded when she offered water, but the image of his steady hands and the quiet kindness in his gaze had never left her. And though life had pulled them into different directions, their souls, unknown to them both, had been tethered by that brief encounter. Now he had come again, not as a stranger, but as someone who carried a weight of his own. His tribe had scattered, his brothers gone, his heart restless with the search for something he couldn't name. For weeks he had wandered near the settlement, watching her from the distance, not out of intrusion, but out of a longing he couldn't silence. He had seen the way she struggled to gather wood, how she sat by her window staring at the horizon as though waiting for the world to return what it had stolen. He had seen her shoulders bend beneath invisible burdens. And one night, after he found her crying silently beside her husband's grave, something inside him broke the barriers of silence, of tribe, of custom. He stepped forward, gently but firmly, and said the words that startled her heart, "Get your things, you're mine now." At first she stared at him, stunned, not knowing whether to resist or collapse into the meaning behind his voice. He didn't mean ownership, not in the way men sometimes claimed women like possessions. He meant belonging, protection, a place where she no longer had to bear grief alone. His words were a vow unspoken, an offering from a man who had little to give except himself. For a moment she wanted to refuse, to push him away, to cling to the comfort of her sorrow because it was the only thing that still tied her to the memory of her husband. But as his hand gently lifted hers, as his eyes met hers with neither demand nor pity, she felt something stir, a fragile remembrance that she was still alive, still capable of being seen, still worthy of warmth. She did not speak, only allowed herself to follow as he led her from the grave toward the cabin where her future waited. The days that followed were uncertain, fragile like glass, as though one wrong step could shatter the delicate bond forming between them. He chopped wood for her, repaired the leaking roof, hunted so that her table was never empty. She in turn stitched his torn clothes, made him meals with trembling hands, and listened to him in the evenings when he told her about the stars, about the rivers he had crossed, about the songs his mother once sang. She discovered that behind his stoic silence was a man scarred by loss as much as she was, a man who had buried family, who had walked through hunger and loneliness, who had loved and lost too many times to count. In him she found not just companionship but recognition, a mirror to her own pain. Still, fear lingered. Neighbors whispered that she was making a mistake, that widows should mourn quietly, that no good could come from loving a man from another world. She heard the cruel remarks, felt the judgment in their eyes, but every evening when she looked across the fire and saw him carving quietly, his presence steady as the earth itself, she knew that what others feared was what her heart had always needed. There came a night when a storm swept across the valley, tearing down fences and flattening crops. Her roof, though mended, shook under the force of the wind, and she clung to him in terror as the thunder roared. He held her, not as a rescuer, but as a partner, whispering softly that storms end, that the land survives, that she too would endure. In his embrace she realized that for the first time in years she wasn't afraid of facing tomorrow. Yet the turning point came unexpectedly. One morning a child wandered to their cabin, a little boy no older than 5, shivering, his clothes torn, his face streaked with tears. He had been lost when the storm separated him from his family, and he had walked through the night until he found their fire. Without hesitation, the Apache lifted him into his arms, wrapped him in his own blanket, and whispered, "You are safe now." The boy clung to him as though he had found not just shelter but a father. Eliza, watching the scene, felt her heart swell with something she hadn't dared to feel in years: hope. They kept the child for 3 days until his frantic parents were found, and when he was finally returned, Eliza wept, realizing that love had not died with her husband. It had simply been waiting to take new form. She turned to the Apache, her voice trembling, and said, "You gave him back his life." He looked at her quietly, then touched her hand, replying, "We gave him back." That moment sealed the bond between them, not of possession, but of chosen belonging. The world might never understand, neighbors might never approve, but in the silence of their cabin, in the strength of his arms and the tenderness of her smile, they found a life rebuilt from ashes. And though grief still lingered like a shadow at times, it no longer ruled her days, for she had learned that love is not limited to one lifetime, that the human heart has an endless capacity to heal, to give, to receive. Months passed, seasons turned, and the woman once defined by loss became a woman defined by courage, by the choice to open herself again to life. And the Apache who once wandered without direction found a home not in the land, but in her. Together they planted new seeds, both in the soil and in their hearts, and as those seeds grew, so did their belief in the power of compassion. The widow was no longer alone, and the Apache was no longer forgotten by the world. They had saved each other. And so, years later, when people spoke of them, they did not speak of scandal or difference, but of the miracle that happens when two broken souls dare to reach across the silence, across the fear, and simply choose love. For in the end, it was never about possession, it was about belonging. And as the fire crackled on those quiet nights, she would sometimes lean close, her lips brushing his ear, and whisper back the words that had once startled her but had since become the sweetest promise. "I'm yours now too."